This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with Verisart founder and CEO Robert Norton. Robert's a pioneer in the world of fine art e-commerce, having founded Saatchi Art and Sedition before starting Verisart in 2015. Inspired by the emerging blockchain, Verisart was founded to provide better certificates of authenticity for traditional artwork. The company now offers a wide range of solutions that include robust digital COAs and the ability to easily mint NFTs from a Shopify plugin. The conversation includes a bevy of insights from the bleeding edge of art and tech. And now, a conversation about authenticity with Verisart's Robert Norton. Robert Norton, thank you so much for joining me this week on the Art Sense podcast. Robert, you're the founder and CEO of Verisart, and I want to talk to you all about what Verisart does and its place in the evolving art and tech ecosystem. But I think it'd be really handy for folks to understand how your career evolved, how you wound up getting to Verisart, because you didn't just wake up one day and have a company that enables the use of blockchain for the art world. There were lots of other steps along the way, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess my grandfather was an art restorer, so we grew up in a household of many paintings that had disputed kind of provenance. We still do have a Joshua Reynolds Age of Innocence painting in my mother's dining room, which is touched by the hand of Reynolds, but not the same as the painting in the National Gallery, but still attributed to the studio. And so I was always kind of curious about this idea that there were ghosts in the system, or authorized copies, or unauthorized kind of copies, and that there was a lot of debate around that. And I guess somehow that stuck in the back of my head for a time. And both my parents did art degrees as well, although they did them kind of later in life. So I guess kind of close to home, I was exposed to paintings in the art world. And my real kind of break moving from consumer tech, I was at AOL in the end of 95, 96. I was the first head of e-commerce for AOL in Europe. I did a bunch of startups and along the way. And then I was introduced to Charles Saatchi in 2009. Kind of that was an opportunity to, I guess, use my experiences and passions for art and creativity and kind of like put that into sort of a tech context. Because prior to that point, I'd been running King.com, the gaming company in North America. And so I came on as founder CEO of Saatchi Art when we recapitalized the business and raised funding for it. And then I met Harry Blaine, who had an idea for selling digital collectibles, a company called Sedition, and I became the co-founder and CEO for that business. And really, having done two art businesses, I wasn't sure I was going to do another one because they are challenging in terms of getting to scale. But in a year off in 2014, another artist, Casey Reese, kind of wrote to me about the potential use of blockchain technology with regards for certification and verification of both physical and digital artworks. And I went down that rabbit hole of blockchain tech and really was excited by the idea of a new distributed kind of database standard and what could be built on top of it. And so that's how I got to Verisart.
Just as I listen to you talk about those different experiences, it just feels like each one of those was a different sort of base jump, and looking back, it's like, oh, well, obviously, these were great ideas. But when Saatchi Art was founded, no one had figured out a way to really capitalize on selling art through e-commerce. And arguably, Sedition was maybe as many as 10 years ahead of its time. Can you kind of talk about being on the cutting edge or bleeding edge in trying to convince people that there are actually markets there for these opportunities?
I mean, it's really difficult because as much as you believe it, the feedback that you often get is contrary to your belief system. And, there's that kind of famous sort of chart that I've seen kind of go around Twitter and stuff in terms of, how long does an entrepreneur stick with something when, the feedback loop that they're getting is just constantly not what they intended. Like you see like months and months saying, okay, is this pointless, is this pointless, is this pointless? And then suddenly you get to a point where there's actually exponential kind of growth. And then everyone thinks you're a genius. But for the times when you're sticking through those months or years when it doesn't get to that stage, everyone thinks, maybe you're not such a genius. Maybe you're actually kind of, not going to succeed. And, I was really inspired by Steve Case because, he ultimately was my boss when I was at AOL, but, I was kind of in the European division, so I only got to meet him once. And, a lot of people kind of think of AOL, in terms of You've Got Mail and the success stories of the kind of, it taking over Time Warner at the end of the the end of the 90s, early sort of 2000s. But what a lot of people don't realize is AOL started in 1983. So what was it doing for 12 years when like people didn't even really have kind of like modem internet connections and they weren't plastering AOL discs on, magazine covers? He was slowly kind of building up what was an incredibly robust thesis around online experiences. It had like content, community, commerce, connectivity. Used to call it the 6 Cs. And so I think it takes a long time, to actually understand what you're doing. And it takes time to build company culture, and it takes time to really find product market fit. So coming back to your kind of question in terms of how did we persuade people in these early days? I don't think we did persuade enough people. I think that, we just had conviction that this was going to work, but we also were having to test that conviction. The conviction was tested. And I remember talking to people saying, I just don't know. People would say to me, people will never buy art on the internet because, it's fine selling books because people understand what they are. It's fine selling anything that's digital, but art you really need to stand in front of. And this was a really compelling argument, and particularly from artists that, you may never have seen their work before, because a lot of the artists on Sedition, in fact, almost all of them were, not the type of artists that you would see at art fairs or in kind of, more public exhibition format. They were often sort of sole traders that didn't have representation. And so it was a very valid point. Like, would people, buy artwork online? And there was definitely a sort of sense of like, well, maybe they won't, because, but what we kind of like were focused on is just building a really good online experience. And I think that, the onus became on the artists to sell themselves, and we just provided the platform for them to affect those sales. And that actually proved to be very successful, in the same way that Etsy is very successful or eBay is very successful, because it just creates a trusted platform for the individual themselves to sell their wares or to share their works. Sedition was more difficult back then because while the tech enabled the idea for somebody to access a digital file, either mainly through a stream, it was largely predicated on the iTunes model. That you paid for something, you thought you owned it, you didn't really own it, you just had a license to kind of view it, which is very different to the NFT model, where you actually do own the token and you can trade it. And the NFT model is the one that has appealed to a greatest number of people because it gives them more sovereignty over that object. But with regards to the Sedition days, I think we were very, very early, and we didn't really have at the beginning that many artists that were also natively digital. We sort of like added them, but when we started, it was Damien Hirst and Tracy Emin and Matt Collishaw, I think Shepard Fairey, maybe I think Bill Viola might have been one of them as well. We had like 6 or so artists that we started with, and they were largely kind of the more well-known artists from the contemporary art market that were, seeing digital editions just as an extension of prints and multiples that could have come before them in other types of physical formats. And I think that was a good way to look at it at the time. But I do think that actually what you're seeing now is that successful digital collectibles are not just a different file format or a different kind of sort of container. They actually also fundamentally operate in a different way. They become a basis for a broader digital experience. And so, the most successful kind of project at the moment in terms of like looking at that would probably be, Bored Apes on the other side, and the way that they're thinking about building out, a community that at its heart now has both, punks and apes as the kind of stakeholders.
Obviously, what has changed between the days of sedition and what artists were trying to do there versus now is the advent of the blockchain. Bitcoin kind of comes on the scene in 2014. Other blockchains like Ethereum add on. We get to 2020. That's where we really see a lot of the acceleration in that. But Verisart, you're very early to the game there in terms of trying to authenticate art on some sort of shared resource, because Verisart, doesn't show up in 2020. They show up, 2015? Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so what did you see that made you jump there?
I was, as part of my, research into kind of Bitcoin, which at the time, in 2014 was really the only kind of like game in town, right? I mean, there was sort of colored coins that Vitalik was kind of working on. There was some conferences I went to at Stanford around scaling Bitcoin, which, seems looking back was kind of the who's who of pretty much the whole kind of crypto community. Vitalik was there, Peter Todd was there, Ethan Bookman from Cosmos Tenement was there, the Dominic Williams from Definity, Juan Bennett from Filecoin, Protocol Labs and IPFS before that. And so just talking to these people who, were at these conferences, one of them I met, Peter Todd, and I sort of said, look, is there even any point in trying to think about building an application on, this type of distributed ledger technology? And at the time it was, really Bitcoin was the only publicly support, like the one that had the most distribution, right? And it still is in terms of the most widely used distributed ledger technology, certainly the one that has the most value associated with it. And it was really just kind of by posing those questions and by being around those people that I was able to connect the dots. And Peter helped us kind of think about the early architecture for Verisart, which in some ways kind of held us back because, Ethereum turned out to be a lot more flexible and adaptable and programmable. And so, while it took a while for NFTs to, kind of emerge as this kind of spectacular moment for the Ethereum, community in terms of, and also for popular culture, people were experimenting obviously with CryptoKitties before that time. That was a sort of 2018 moment, right? Or 2018, I think, or 2019. And it wasn't really, NFTs didn't really come to the fore until end of 2020, beginning of 2021, when they became sort of popularized with the sort of record-breaking Beeple sale at Christie's in sort of spring of 21. I think the reason why why I thought it was a good idea is that when you think about artworks and collectibles, they have this sort of tension between opacity and transparency, So, transparency is kind of aided by availability of data, public auction results, Instagram, Google image search. There were lots of things that were happening in the kind of like Web 2 world that were making the art market more transparent, just more visually transparent. And I think Instagram had a huge part to play in that. And at the same time, value is still largely opaque, right? Like, you don't go into a gallery and like, am I getting the best value for this painting? You just want to buy that painting because that painting means something to you, and you hope that you're not getting treated unfairly. But the reality is that you are, as an unknown buyer to the gallery, going to be treated more unfairly than one of their best collectors, in the same way that almost every industry looks after their, preferred customers. So that's not an unusual kind of thing to happen. But ultimately, one of the problems that has happened with the NFT market is that you've had this sort of like financialization of everything that is art within that world, and as a result, it became quite a confused world in terms of, are people there for collecting or for speculating? And this year we've kind of seen that it seems that a lot or therefore speculating more than collecting, as the herds kind of migrated off kind of platforms to ones that didn't support creator royalties, and arguably there were more aligned to a speculator's interest and a collector's interest. And so I think that there is some danger in kind of having full transparency in an art world context, because ultimately, when you have that, it leads to some type of like pure financialization, and then it becomes just like a sort of a market, and then the assets could be anything. And I think that a lot of artists tend to want to resist joining those types of markets. Others might be fine with it, but in terms of the blockchain as a technology, what was interesting to me personally was really about provenance, because what I was seeing in when I started Verisart in 2015, it was in the wake of the Nodler scandal. So that was the big story in the art world at the time, which is that how in 2014 could the chairman of Sotheby's be duped into buying fake Rothkos? I mean, it seemed kind of crazy, right? It seemed like something that would have happened maybe 100 years earlier, but actually it was still happening. And I think that there's still a big problem in terms of who do you trust, and if you're unable to trust like some of the oldest or the oldest gallery in New York, then who do you trust? And so I really think that I was motivated to see if we could use the tech to build a better system where people could have more trust about the transaction ahead of time. And digital certification for physical objects was really where we started. And we're still improving that experience every day, and we get better at it. And it's a difficult challenge because you've got an air gap between the digital record and the physical item that you need to deal with. You've also got the fact that just because you have a blockchain transaction doesn't necessarily mean anything that is true about that transaction. So you also have a gap between the record and the transaction on the blockchain, and what you're saying about that. And people are seeing that more more and more in the NFT world, where you could just simply put up an asset that has already been sold somewhere else and put it on another chain and then sell it or something. And there's a lot of problems in terms of like knowing, actually, is this the real thing? Is this by the real person? And what's the real story of this object? And I think that that's what we continue to iterate and improve upon, is how best to verify authenticity. And for us, what was a big advance with the blockchain was really a few kind of like basic building blocks that helped us build a better service for creators and collectors. And those building blocks were the use of a shared timeline, one that wasn't open um, to interpretation or to dispute. And timeline is often one of the things that gets falsified first in the case of a fake work. And then the second thing is, that there was a level of attestations that were provable cryptographically, that there was a consistency of key signatures that were used in terms of binding claims around an object. And then, the other thing is that the append-only data database structure of the blockchain was also kind of helpful. And so we really just, with Peter Todd, kind of worked with those building blocks and also utilizing his service open timestamps to build better certification standards. And when we were talking to people, we said, okay, well, it may not be perfect, but what's the status quo today? And the status quo back then, and still is actually largely for people, is that you get a piece of paper sent to you in the post saying this is your certificate of authenticity for high value artwork that you bought. And the problem about pieces of paper is you can't run real-time verification and provenance on a piece of paper. So I envisage a world one day where anything that has value will have a verifiable record associated with it, and that those records will be utilizing the blockchain for their trust and veracity.
You identified a problem that's been going on for years and years, and even just in the press in the last couple of weeks here in North America and Canada, they finally handed down some sentencing on a huge forgery scandal that was going on in the indigenous art world there with an artist, Morrisseau. I think they estimate that as many as 60 to 70% of the works in the market under his name were forgeries, and some of them were even perpetrated by nephews of the artist. And like you said, some of the biggest gallery names could smell that it was bad, but were turning a blind eye because it was profitable. But it seems that since you came to the problem solving at a point prior to NFTs, you have kind of diagnosed the problem solving for the traditional art world and have incorporated the digital aspect in the NFTs as that has grown. It's not like you're an NFT platform that's trying to back their way into the traditional art world. It's been very symbiotic and natural, the way this has kind of grown up to your current product offering, right?
Yeah, I mean, so when we started, I think we were the first company to apply blockchain to physical art market. And we started with a mobile app that we just gave to artists and said, hey, we really think it's important for you to keep records of your work, because fundamentally, if you give that responsibility to your dealers, then you're not really in control of, your IP, and you're not the arbiter of truth. And what happens in the art market is kind of a little bit crazy, right? Is that an artist gets successful, and then they think, or his dealers think, or their dealers think, I should say, that well, maybe we should do a definitive catalog of all the works this artist has done. And part of that is to find out, how many works are out there, also find out who the collectors of these works are, and then see if you can increase the prices. That's one of the kind of like motivating factors in putting this together. But it seems, kind of crazy that it would be done at the end of the artist's life, when the artist is going to be like probably unable to easily remember everything that they've done. It would make much more sense to do it as the artist proceeds through life. And nowadays you could take a picture of something on your mobile phone, you can add some basic information, you're effectively building a catalog raisonné real time. And that's how many artists use Verisart. They are effectively building their catalog raisonné in real time, and we even have some plans to pass the data to enable them to actually show it more as a catalog raisonné in time. And I think that makes a lot more sense, because the result of giving that responsibility over to your dealers is problematic for the following reasons. Because many artists will have different dealers in different parts of the country, and those dealers won't be with them throughout the whole of their life. They'll be with them perhaps for a period of time. So now you've got a whole bunch of different records of certificates of authenticity that this artist is purporting to, all being sent out by different dealers with their own kind of like certificate of authenticity standards, if they're even sending them out at all. Many of them are just sending you the invoice. And then the artist has a problem like, okay, you might have sent me my check, and this check purports to be to be for my commission on the sale of these works. But what happens when, the artist doesn't keep such good records, or the gallery or the dealer is no longer around, and now suddenly, like, who really knows what they sold? And so that's a problem, and it becomes a compounding problem. So what we kind of said to the artist was like, it's really important for you to be at the center of your the artists own their IP from an image licensing point of view. They should have a record of everything they've done. They should also have records of all of their editions and their prints and their multiples and everything, because ultimately, when fraud takes place and there are bad actors, the net result is it doesn't harm the dealers that sold those works in the past. It harms the value of the artist market moving forward, right? And so, look at like Dali or Modigliani, or kind of like artists that have like, specifically been the sort of target of like lots of forgery in their market, and it results in, more caution around buying and less liquidity. And more, a less healthy market. And so that's negative for the artists or for their heirs.
Well, I mean, it seems really tricky because, in a way, artists are small businesses. They're entrepreneurs, but the nature of who they are and what they make, being a small business owner, I don't know if that's innately natural to who these people are, right? If you ask an artist, I think they would say they would prefer to spend all their time making, so that, nothing else really cluttered up their mind. How do you go about convincing and educating artists on the importance of that component? Because, I mean, it could be scary for an artist. I mean, there's always this fallacy that if you're with the right gallery, if you're with the right dealer, the numbers are just going to work. But if you kind of put all of the intellectual capital in the hands of the dealer in terms of the business side, you're really kind of binding yourself to that gallery or dealer, because that creates high switching costs. You're going to feel less like you're able to go to a different gallery or dealer, given you don't know exactly what's going on inside the black box, right?
Everybody has their own view of what they consider the art market to be. And if you ask, many of the kind of like collectors of digital art that, have come to the fore, on the back of like riches in the crypto world, they will sort of talk about Beeple or Rafik Anadol, or Dmitry Cherniak, or the sort of the whole roster of the kind of like art blocks artists. Yeah, exactly. And that's a very different world to those people that are going to Art Basel. I mean, there's a little bit of crossover. There's a few opportunistic kind of dealers that might show some of their works on their booth, but Pace has a relationship with Art Blocks, but it's definitely the exception rather than the norm. And likewise, if you think about a lot of the well-known artists like Shepard Fairey or COAs or Banksy, Banksy's the most followed artist in terms of an Instagram account. These are artists again that like really kind of grew up outside the system in the same way like those artists that I mentioned in the kind of NFT world have grown up outside the kind of the system. They're not the same. They don't have the same stakeholders as the people that are owning Basquiat's or Warhol's or Gerhard Richter's or David Hockney's. And so, that's kind of what is exciting, is that the auction houses kind of brought these two worlds together through these spectacular series of sales in 2021. But I would just sort of argue that there are just, the art market is changing, and Raphael Rosendahl, who's a really talented digital artist, was sort of talking last year at DLD, and he said that NFTs for him represented kind of the equivalent to the art market as recorded music and the record did for music. Is that in the past people went to the concert hall to listen to the music, and it was a formal performance, and you had to go, and that's a little bit like sort of people going to the gallery and seeing the artwork in a kind of formal setting. And then suddenly they were kind of playing their records at their home and sort of dancing, with their loved ones or their kind of like, family members. And now they're sort of sharing their, NFTs on their mobile phones, or, putting them onto their screen and just, talking about their interest in kind of like, these digital collectibles or visual culture or pop culture, or however you want to kind of describe it. And so what that kind of means is that, the way that we experience things is changing. And in the same way that, and I happen to know Shepard well because, he's been using Verisart since the outset, and now also uses us for his kind of physical prints as well as his original works. And I've learned a lot from, my discussions with him over the years. But, this is an artist that, started by, rigging the kind of photocopying machine when he was a student at RISD, and like, printing out stuff and just handing them out, and, finding ways to kind of like reach his audience through magazines and through sort of just sort of real kind of guerrilla marketing, basically. And what's happening is that artists are actually now having more significant relationships with their communities, and that's where you see certainly like artists that are exploring that, like Pack, and even just the way that the communities are kind of like really being thought through. I think Damien Hirst's Currency project, very community kind of focused. And I would expect that in the same way that, you saw a lot of the music world change when people were just able to go onto YouTube and like, start recording, and, Justin Bieber kind of famously sort of like started that way. You're seeing a lot of new artists that, are really engaging with the fact that their communities are there online, and, they want to buy their artworks as NFTs, and they want to then have tokenized experiences, and they are starting to think about those worlds. And it's a different type of artist, right? It's a different type of artist than the artist that, is just painting on canvases and sending those to a gallery to sell their work. It's a different type of artist.
I think that's one of the things that becomes more and more evident the more time you spend around the NFT world and what makes a successful NFT drop. And I think that one of the big things there is engagement, kind of one-on-one engagement between the artist and the collectors as a community, and what's expected in terms of connection in the community. It's funny, you were saying Steve Case had 6 C's. 2 of those you said were content and community, and I, immediately thought about NFTs, right? Mm-hmm. When you give Shepard Fairey as an example, Shepard was on episode 71 of the podcast. Like you say, he came from outside of the traditional art world, and a lot of his growth was in doing things that were related to grassroots counterculture. There's something intrinsic about mobilizing a grassroots organization that kind of overlays to what these successful NFT projects look like, correct?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, we did these series of curated auctions for Super Rare in 2021, 10 by 10 and 8 by 8, and Shepherd was part of those first sort of 10 artists whose inaugural NFTs we sold. So it was Shepherd, Michael Jew, Rob Pruitt, Random International, Universal Everything, Jonathan Yeo, and some others. I think Neil Belufa and Petra Wright. And they were really nervous, to be honest, because none of these people really did engage much with their community. I think Neil Belufa sort of and more than most, because he was actually quite an early kind of crypto enthusiast. But the others were just quite nervous. And they were also reminding me a little bit about some of the artists during the early days of Sedition that were also quite nervous about how do they move into a new world, and getting moving out of your comfort zone is difficult for people, and no one wants to kind of fail publicly. We sold all the works, and Shepherd's actually sold for the most. At the time, I think it was over $250,000, the sale of his inaugural NFT. It was a learning process, because while that was a lot of money and he was happy with the sale, there were kind of other artists that were selling for more than that, on Super Rare, that really had only been known to a small community for a relatively short period of time. And so finding your audience is kind of the first job, I think, of any artist, right? Like whenever you're a visual artist, a recording artist, an author, it's connecting with your audience, and it's not easy. And so, I have a lot of respect for these artists that have so well managed to connect with their new audiences. I think Danny Cole's a really good example of a young artist that has found really new ways to connect audiences. And it was amazing to see the Hammerstein Ballroom during NFT NYC a couple of years ago, and it just, the whole thing was packed, as if he was a pop star. And I think that's again what's exciting about digital collectibles, is that it's bringing to the fore new voices, and also kind of like new collectors as well. So I think that's the thing about art, right? It constantly moves forward, because ultimately we have this like endless well of creativity, us as humans, and that creativity is competitive with the past, and it wants to do something that's new and defining for the present. And so that's why art pushes us forward. And it's natural that artists are going to want to experiment with new tools that are up there, that are available to them. And that's why you've seen, now this kind of really big uproar regarding some of the AI algorithms that are being trained on well-known artists' kind of like work, or artists' work that's definitely not in the public domain, i.e. that the artists are still alive. And and you just probably saw yesterday, Adobe kind of released a version of its engine that it's proudly kind of calling a fair AI art engine, because it's only been trained on works that don't infringe other people's IP. And there's going to be some really important cases that lie ahead when it comes to thinking about some of the tool sets that artists are using that are infringing other artists' IP. Because ultimately, IP for the artist is that is basically their whole work, right? If you take away their kind of like copyright in their image, and now it's suddenly freely available for anyone, ultimately you're kind of you're devaluing, and you're kind of weakening that voice. And that's why those laws are there is to protect the value of that voice for a period of time.
AI is a really, I think it's exciting and scary, and that could be said about every digital revolution, right?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think that we can get sort of hung up about the tool sets. I mean, ultimately, blockchain is a tool for building new decentralized applications on top of, and AI is going to be a tool for all types of things, right? That you can kind of run the algorithming on that data set, but the experience is not the tool. The experience, is going to be spatial computing, right? The experience was, the visual interface of the mouse and the screen, and being able to kind of look at a computer in a new way that felt more tied to kind of your bodily movements, right? That kind of like that gestural interface. And then the mobile kind of revolution that was again, like it took the experience of everything that you could do, whatever it is you wanted to do on a computer, and put it in the palm of your hand. And arguably, spatial computing is really going to be the next foundation for new experiences. And blockchain and AI, they can fit in, all of these different kind of experiences. But ultimately, I think we're going to see more artists kind of, the moment there've been some like attempts, by artists to, like John Rathman has done stuff. I mean, I think there was also Jordan Woolston did something in VR. I mean, a few years ago, you went to the art fairs and they all had like some VR headsets with some artists or another doing stuff in VR, but it was very kind of like, crude. And I think, when Apple releases its headset, later this year, and suddenly, it's, going to be a different experience to, they're hoping it will be like what the iPhone was to the mobile phone market. We're like, why would I want any other mobile phone when I can have an iPhone? And Apple's headset, is going to be significantly different than the other headsets we've seen, because it's going to kind of allow you to have your face, the front of your face kind of scanned, and create a different set of data points in terms of, what your kind of emotions are, or what you're sort of looking at. And I think that you'll see, really interesting kind of like work with artists that are exploring spatial computing as well. And so, we've seen the history of art is one of artists continuing to push the sort of collective visual consciousness forward by new experiences or new representations or new philosophies that are brought to the fore in that specific view and voice of the artist. And so I just think that we will continue to see more. So in the same way that you talked about kind of like Shepard's and his sort of the way that he built his practice, which was unique to him, and he found a vocabulary and Andre the Giant and whatever the kind of like paper stock was that he could afford, or how he was kind of like running off those kind of printers, and have the works of kind of like Banksy, which is often like real world interventions. He's going to places and he's leaving almost somewhat like he's intervening right into the world with his artists, and taking the art out of the gallery and putting it into the war zone or the conflict zone, or the area that he wants to shine the light onto. And if you look at kind of COAs and his kind of huge sculptures that float around the world, and again, like seeing things differently, or what JR does, these are very much kind of like works that are made to be photographed in the context of their surroundings. And I think that, you will see artists think about their, surroundings in a purely digital environment. And I think that will be different to the way that artists have so far kind of just used some kind of like motion graphics to create sort of visual, visual gimmickry that arguably, doesn't really push a lot of the thinking forward from, what artists doing in the 60s with, pattern-based art and so, they're just finding different audiences at different times. But ultimately, you're going to continue to see artists kind of push the boundaries and evolve, and where we expect to see art will evolve. And I think that's what's exciting about spatial computing. And whether or not today's NFTs will be a meaningful experience in that type of environment is yet to be seen, but they certainly could provide a foundational access point through verifiable ownership or sort of tokenization that allows people to then build experiences on top of. And I would expect to see artists really think of NFTs as a building block for unlocking additional experiences or offers to their audiences. And in fact, we're already seeing that. At Verisart a few months ago, we did a project with Johnny Depp and the team at Never Fear Truth, and he minted a bunch of NFTs last year, not with us, but then he used us to token gate and to add digital certification, and we gave a API redemption point so that you could see whether the token ID had been redeemed for the physical print. I think this is going to become like increasingly common that artists will, more seamlessly go between the digital and the physical world, and the way that you'll hopefully be able to traverse that will involve some form of blockchain. At least that's what we believe at Verisart.
What is becoming the biggest part of your product offering? I mean, who are you helping the most? Is it the digital artist that's looking to mint NFTs? Is it the physical artist that wants to have digital certificates of authenticity? Do those digital certificates then sort of serve, the same purpose as an NFT? Is it the galleries that you're helping? It seems like you've got your hands in a number of things, and it's really encouraging because the fact that you guys are, integrated with Shopify means that a huge barrier has been lowered in terms of, I feel like one of the things that was really holding back traditional art collectors from getting into the space is just how complex it had been in terms of getting a particular currency, getting a particular wallet. But it seems like, especially with the Shopify integration, we're really lowering barriers for folks, right?
Yeah, well, no one likes doing paperwork, and no one likes doing digital paperwork either. And so, one of the challenges that we sort of had with even our digital COAs is that some still had to kind of send them out at the time of the sale. And that was something that, people weren't used to doing. And the cool thing about the Shopify integration is that the certificate of authenticity just goes out the same way that the Shopify's invoice goes out. It's just at the point of sale. So it's a really neat experience for the collector because they buy their asset, they buy their work, and they get their NFT if they're using us for minting and selling NFTs. They get their certificate for their physical objects as well at the point of sale immediately. And so collectors like that. But in terms of like the platform, it's just been iterative, and we've been around since 2015. So it would be crazy if we didn't evolve. And so, we are an all-in-one platform for verifying physical and digital collectibles. We also enable minting of NFTs. We enable selling of those NFTs through any Shopify storefront just by downloading our app. It's doesn't require any code to set up. And then we also offer kind of token gating as well. And that's all just done through either Shopify, the Shopify app or Verisart.com. And then in terms of, our SaaS business, we have individual plans that appeal more to individual creators. And then we have business plans that appeal to people that represent those creators. And at the heart, what we've built, we have this concept that the person representing the creator needs to have the creator's approval prior to being able to make claims on that creator's behalf. And the patent for our certification, which others have emulated, is around the fact that the certificate can change state depending on the consensus of the authorizing parties and the information that's been added to that certificate. So what I mean by that is that I, as a collector, may say, hey, this is an object that I own, but I can't create a certificate of authenticity for that object because I'm not the person that made it. But I can create a record. I can have that record endorsed by the creator. I can add a tag to the back of the object to show some link between the object and the record. And so our certificate kind of understands different states, and we kind of call them, registered records, certificates of authenticity, and then certificates of authenticity plus. And that's where a physical link is attached. And it's a little bit more complex than that in terms of like the way we think things in the back end. So we also have a concept of whether the metadata is basic or extended, and then the completeness of the record from the verified issuer, whether it's been authorized by the creator, whether there's extended object details, and whether there's a physical link. And each one of these kind of proof points is registered in a timeline which is bound to the blockchain.
I have one last question for you, and that is, listening to you talk, it seems like you're always 5 or 10 years ahead of everyone else. What, we've talked a little bit about spatial art, AI. What do you see on the horizon? What big opportunities do you still see out there, or things that you're excited of thinking more about, or problems to solve? Outside of just putting one foot in front of the other with Verisart, what do you see on the horizon that is exciting you?
I think that there's something that we kind of it's something that we have called a fair trade art certificate standard, where there is a way to identify whether the artist or the person representing the artist, it could be a brand or a gallery, platform that's selling it, and any kind of cause that could be political, could be charitable, could be social, whatever the cause is. I think that there's a really important role to be played in. I think about some of the artists, and I think Shepard and JR fall into that category. So does Banksy as well. Social activism. And the world has significant problems that we're dealing with already, right? We have a war in Europe. We closer to the threat of nuclear war than we've been in my lifetime. But we also have a war against climate change. We have a war against kind of species extinction. We have a lot of things that the world needs to kind of fix. And you've got many of the smartest and wealthiest people building like space plans to find ways to us to become a planetary kind of species. But there's a lot of challenges in terms of fixing this world. And one of the things that I was really inspired by is the way that a visual or like an artwork can kind of galvanize consciousness quite quickly. And actually, that's often the case, right? We think about transforming moments in art history as ones that are sort of defined by, specific kind of artworks like Picasso's Demoiselle d'Avignon, like the birth of kind of the modern art movement, and Jackson Pollock and kind of like abstract expressionism, and these sort of points in time or points in our history are often kind of can be described by visual representation, that people kind of understand a whole set of other things by just looking at that one painting. And so I think that that's very kind of common to who we are, is to kind of experience a broader set of concerns through something singular. And so, I don't know if you remember, a few years ago there was this there was this egg that was on Instagram that was cracking under pressure, and it resulted in a Super Bowl commercial around mental health. But at one point, it was the most publicly shared image on Instagram, and it was just a regular egg. It was called World Record Beating Egg. And it's very, we live in a world where people can galvanize very, very fast. And there's no better way to kind of like galvanize people, I think, than everybody having to have seen something. And so when we saw that image of the first the black hole, the image of like, what does a black hole look like? And no one really knew what a black hole looked like. Now everybody has that image in their mind. And so I think that there's a role for artists to play in helping, us understand the challenges of the world and how the world is sort of changing. And so one of the things that, I think is exciting is, how do you, as a customer, as a collector, you think about like the fair trade movement in terms of understanding the origin of how the coffee bean was kind of like made, or who the growers were. You see a lot more of this type of narrative playing out now, just in your regular kind of supermarket, right? It's a story that's being told around the object. It's not just a set of kind of like ingredients, and it's kind of more than marketing. It's people want to sort of feel like they're supporting the right guy, or that they're sort of doing good. And I think that there's a role for artists to play in helping us kind of like galvanize our attention towards the sort of challenges of our time. And John Gerard's an interesting artist that actually kind of like is engaged with these types of issues. I would argue that JR is very engaged with these types of issues, and I think that people look to artists to help them make sense of the world. And so I mentioned the kind of like fair trade art certificate, because this idea that you have kind of like a way of identifying works that are there for a social good, works that are there to design to give back, works that are there to raise awareness of something, I think is an important thing for the art world to look out to. And I think that is more meaningful than just selling works at expensive auction dinners. It's a way of really building a broader movement. And to some degree, if you look at the sustainable economic goals that the UN set, that had an icon of these different colors for the different sort of goals. And I think we can do a lot more than that. And I think artists will play a part in that. So I would look for more social activism by artists moving forward.
Well, Robert, I really appreciate you sitting down to talk to me about your amazing journey and your really insightful knowledge of this space and how it's all fitting together, and the possibilities for the future. And so I really appreciate the generosity of your time today.
Thank you for having me on the Art Sense podcast. It's a great group of people that you interview, and I'm delighted to be part of it. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to Art Sense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.